let's get into our main topic. And the main topic is this. Apple has announced a whole bunch of software, which is great. Got to update your software. I'm pretty sure this is the first event that it's been all software based, and I don't think they debuted any hardware off of that. With that, they announced, what did they announce? They announced Apple News Plus, which is an enhanced news service, reader service, so you can get your magazines. You can get it basically replaced Apple Bookstore, if you remember that one. They have Apple Arcade. So just like with Google last week announcing that they're getting in the gaming business, Apple's really moving their games out of one area and putting it into an area where, you know, they can possibly do a lot of different things with their games. And could there also be a Twitch-like channel coming soon for Apple and their arcade? Anyway, Apple TV is their streaming service. They've gotten into the streaming game, so now you have Netflix, you have Hulu, you have Amazon, and Apple Podcast or Apple TV Plus. And they've put in a whole bunch of really cool shows, and they've got some big names in those shows. So that's definitely going to debut. Now, with all that said, all these new updates that we're going to see in the fall, where does podcasting come in? There was not a mention of an Apple Podcasting Plus. But if you think about it, Apple News Plus and Apple TV Plus could easily start hosting and having podcasts. Now, will it have the regular Joe Blow podcast, like it's, you know, the guys sitting around the kitchen table talking Dungeons and Dragons or basket weaving or anything like that? Probably not. But higher end podcasts, you know, the Podcast One podcast, the iHeartRadio podcasts, the things like that, can definitely start leaking in to the cracks of Apple News Plus, of Apple TV Plus, because it's all media, it's all news, it's a mixed up, muddled up, shook up world, even for Lola. Sam. So, but it is interesting to see these new apps and the new organization structure. So really, you have Apple News Plus, you have Apple Arcade, just regular Arcade, not Arcade Plus, because I don't know, they could have had Apple Arcade Fire and really just kind of had that relationship with Ben, but that's a different story. And then Apple TV Plus. And podcasts are going to fit all three of those areas. News Plus, if a podcast is in a magazine, it's going to be on Apple News Plus. In Arcade, I'm really thinking that they're going to start planning some sort of Twitch channel and bring gaming podcasting into that area. And then, of course, Apple TV Plus. You know, shows like, a good example for a TV podcast is The Talking Dead, which is the recap of The Walking Dead and Fear the Walking Dead. And now there's a lot of interest to bring podcasts for specific shows. It doesn't always work. I think Game of Thrones had a podcast, and it was lukewarm on its reception, but I don't think that I might be wrong. Don't get me wrong. I'm pretty sure that they didn't do one for last year. And of course, since Game of Thrones took like 2 years to get to this final season, it was probably harder to maintain a show like that. But with Walking Dead or Talking Dead, you had Walking Dead, you had Fear the Walking Dead, and then you could kind of cross over to some of the other stuff too. You know, talking about Into the Badlands and things like that. Just kind of a geek culture type thing. And of course, you got Chris Hardwick. That's part of that. So he made that happen. So that's on Apple TV Plus. Can your podcast be on Apple TV Plus? I have no doubt on that. I'm still waiting for somebody to come around and make a channel that would actually be on TV that would highlight people's podcasts. Kind of like a talk soup for podcasts. Video, audio. So you'd give permission to use a clip from your show. They'd email you and you'd say, yeah, I give you my permission, sign a little waiver, whatever. And then you're on the show. And of course, that has to happen in a very short window. So you record your podcast, they watch it within the day, and they say, hey, we want to use this clip right here. They email you. If they don't hear a response, they don't use it. If they do, then they put it in the show, and then you've got an actual show on Apple TV Plus that is part of that. Excuse me a second. I think I got to sneeze here. Hold on. Oh, apologies there. So, with that said, podcasting can go into these three areas very easily. But what about Apple Podcasts? Is there a need to create an Apple Podcasts Plus? Redesign the podcasting app. They've already done that. So into this current iteration. But will they do it to the next iteration? And I think the answer is yes, they will eventually. And maybe in the next year or two, you'll see a Podcast Plus, because it will need to figure out a way, and maybe Podcast will have this way to do this, integrate into these other three. Boom, like that. Podcasts, we got Apple TV Plus, we got Arcade, and we've got News Plus. Boom, podcast right there. You get the idea. And it needs to all integrate with each other. It needs to work together as one cohesive unit. So, because with podcasting, it's the definition of podcasting eventually is got to go away, because the definition of what a podcast is, heck, we don't even make e-publications anymore, and that is technically a podcast if you put it in the RSS feed. But there's so many different ways. This show right here on Facebook, I consider a podcast. Even though it doesn't have an RSS feed in Facebook, I do have an RSS feed for the audio version. But I have a delivery method through Facebook. And I can put it on my page back on howtorecordpodcast.com. Excuse me. And keep it going that way. And eventually, RSS feeds are not going to be around, I would guess, in 5-10 years. So either that or they'll have to change. Last week we talked about blockchain. Can we put podcasting in blockchain? And one of the factors on that is the one of the factors is the RSS feed. And so if we have to change that from RSS to JSON or something like that, we can do that and continue to podcast. And of course, the definition will have been changed forever. So, with that said, I asked the question on the poll, which you can definitely answer, and that is, do you like Apple Podcasts in the current state? Either you, and now this isn't as a creator, this is as a listener. Do you listen through your Apple Podcasts, or you do not have an Apple device to do that, or you don't? I get my podcast not as much through the podcast app. A lot of the times I get these shows through other means. Stitcher is a perfect example. It's a great app. It had its questionable area when they changed names a couple times, but the new Stitcher app, everything's stable, and as long as that stability is there, then I think they've got a pretty good alternate to Apple. Of course, if you use a Google device, then you're most likely using Google Podcasts, and so you don't use Apple Podcasts at all.